Good morning, it's Friday, August 8th, and this is To My Liberal Friends. Today I want to talk a little bit about federal spending and the budget. As a nation, we're deeply in debt. That national debt is now just about $37 trillion, and there seems to be little to no effort to control the rise. In 1995, the deficit was about $5 trillion, and 30 years later, basically a generation, it has increased by 700%. It's not sustainable. Democrats don't even talk about cutting spending, and Republicans give it lip service at best. But nothing will ever be done until politicians of both parties begin to realize that the public no longer trusts them, and that some massive changes have to occur, or my children and grandchildren will be saddled with a debt they cannot pay just because my generation was unwilling to give up things they liked from the federal government. And we've become numb to the numbers that are thrown around. When I was in Washington, there was an old saying that was attributed to former Senator Everett Dirksen. When describing government spending, he said, $1 million here, $1 million there. Pretty soon you're talking real money. Eventually, that little saying morphed from millions to billions, and today it's approaching trillions. In the years leading up to the pandemic, annual federal government spending hovered between 5 and 5.3 trillion, adjusted for inflation. Then the COVID came along and hit in 2020, and the budget really took off up to 7.7 trillion to help us through the crisis. Federal spending has exceeded $6 trillion every year since, because once you start a program, people like it, and Congress has no will to cut it. And it's really hard to make sense of $1 trillion of anything, so try thinking of it this way. If you spent $1,000 every day, it would take over 16,000 years to spend $6 trillion. That's a pretty big number. In 2023, the federal government spent less than it did the previous year as COVID spending went away, and only spent $6.2 trillion, but it took $4.5 trillion in mostly tax revenue. That means our government had to come up with $1.7 trillion to cover the difference between spending and revenue. And in government speak, that's our deficit. So how do we get these deficits? About 60% of all federal spending is categorized as mandatory spending, which amounted to $3.8 trillion last year. This spending is essentially on autopilot because it funds programs whose eligibility rules and benefit formulas are set in law. This consists mostly of programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and Veterans Care. Then there's the interest on our debt, which totaled $659 billion last year. If we're going to have to pay our interest on our debt, just like everybody else, everything else Washington does, from defense and education to transportation and scientific research, it's all funded what's called discretionary spending, which only accounted for $1.7 trillion last year. So as you can see, the bulk of the spending is in the mandatory spending. When you add all this up, you find that $3.8 trillion in mandatory spending, $1.7 trillion in discretionary spending, and the interest on the debt of $659 billion, it comes up to about $6.2 trillion. Well, the two biggest aspects of that mandatory spending, as I've said, are Social Security and Medicare. Social Security has been around since 1935. It provides retirement, disability, and survivor benefits to eligible individuals. It now costs about $1.4 trillion a year and accounts for 22% of total federal budget. And there are over 67 million people receiving Social Security, and they're getting an average benefit around $1,900 a month for the actual retirees, and disabled and surviving spouses get a little bit less. The way Social Security was set up, it should be funded on payroll taxes from current workers, and that goes into what's called a trust fund. And we hear a lot about that, quote, trust fund. It's really just on paper. And then that trust fund pays out the benefits of those who receive them. With an aging population, we see projections that the Social Security Trust Fund will be exhausted by the year 2032. And that means Congress will have to do something, or benefits will have to be cut, and the estimate is about 20%. Now, I want to point out these are projections, and once again, they could be right or they could be wrong. As the old Yankee catcher from years ago, Yogi Berra, liked to say, quote, "It's tough to make predictions, especially about the future," end quote. The second biggest mandatory spending item is Medicare. Medicare costs the federal government about $850 billion in 2023, and that's about 14% of our federal spending. Today, Medicare covers 67 million Americans, or about 1 in 4 adults. And in the latest data that we have in 2022, we spend about $16,000 per beneficiary per year. Medicare's share of the federal budget has increased from 10% in 1994 to 14% in today's programs, and it continues to grow as our population ages. Then we get to Medicaid. This is a program that provides health insurance for those who can least afford it and is jointly financed by the federal and state governments. In total, the federal government, though, paid for $616 billion of this cost in 2023. And as of December of that year, there are about 78 million Americans on Medicaid, and enrollment of the programs has exploded since Obama expanded it under the Affordable Care Act. Congress tried to make some changes in this program in the last tax bill, and Democrats were outraged and have attempted to politicize it. But when almost 22% of the population is on Medicaid, something is wrong. And I want to point out they did not cut Medicaid spending, they just slowed its growth. And they put some work requirements in, which most people in the country agree with. Then you add in veterans care, and you come up with those programs that are mandatory, and we have to keep spending on them. But that does not mean we cannot make reforms that will reduce the expenditures and try to get people off these programs, particularly Medicaid, and back into the workforce. There are reforms we could do to Social Security, but that would make it more, and it would make it more fiscally sound, and we should be looking at those. But that's the third rail of politics, and politicians are afraid. So anyone familiar with the federal budget realizes we don't have a revenue problem because revenues are at an all-time high, but we certainly have a spending problem. Politicians like to spend money because they go home and tell their constituents, I did this for you. What they don't tell you is I also saddled your children and grandchildren with the cost to pay for those things I did for you. As a nation, we're going to have to tighten our belts, and it will be painful for everybody. If we don't, we will teeter on the edge of bankruptcy within a few years, and nobody's going to benefit from that. This has been To My Liberal Friends. Thanks for listening.